Welcome back to the Energeia podcast, everyone. This is Dr. G, and today I will be speaking with George Richardson. George is Associate Professor of Counseling and Coordinator for the Substance Abuse Counseling Program in the College of Education, Criminal Justice, and Human Services at the University of Cincinnati. He is an interdisciplinary researcher whose work has primarily focused on evaluating the validity of theoretical constructs, developmental theories, and scores derived from psychosocial measures. George's work uses evaluations of evolutionary developmental theories of individual differences in high-risk traits and behaviors, such as substance use, particularly in regard to alcohol usage. His research has also endeavored to reduce bias in measures used to assess diverse groups and has used twin and family designs to conduct tests of developmental theories using controls for unobserved familial confounds, particularly in genetics. George currently works for a number of academic journals, serving as statistical advisor and handling editor at Addiction Research and Theory, associate editor at Evolutionary Psychology, and methodology editor at Evolutionary Psychological Science, as well as serving on the editorial board at Measurement and Evaluation in Counseling and Development. And as an author, George's research has been published in outlets such as Frontiers in Psychology, Human Nature, Evolution and Human Behavior, the Journal of Drug Education, and the Journal of Professional Counseling. And with that, George, welcome to the Energeia podcast, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. We've crossed paths a few times around the traps over the years at conferences and stuff, and I've always kind of like low-key, scholarly stalker admired your work from afar, so I was very, very excited to have you on the show. And I just thought, in terms of the progression of our conversation today, that maybe we'll start with a narrow focus on the work that you do, or the work that you're mostly involved with now, and then we can kind of fan things out to a broader scope as we move toward the end. So with your blessing, I thought a good starting point might be a recognition of the fact that you were very recently awarded a grant from the National Institute of Alcohol and Alcoholism. And I'm going to assume this is a richly deserved grant and one that warrants a hearty congratulations. But perhaps without revealing any more than you can at this early stage, can you put your receiving of that award in context for us a little bit, and tell us a bit about where those resources are going to be directed, what you're hoping to achieve with that grant, and I guess bigger picture, more broadly, what this grant reflects about what you're currently involved with in your professional and scholarly life at the moment.
Yeah, okay. That one, I would say I started to focus a bit more on alcohol use disorder maybe 4 years ago, and I started writing this application 3 years ago, I think, getting a team together. Then 2 years ago, we submitted the application, and we revised it after that, and then the revision was funded. And it'll support us as we use some data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent and Young Adult Health, and that's a set that contains data running from adolescence to mid-adulthood now, and they're still collecting the data. And they have a number of people who have sought out treatment in the set that say they did, that have used 12 steps. And so we have basically a pretty data collected over a pretty long span, and we're going to evaluate some relatively new definitions of recovery from alcohol use disorder that have been broadened. So it used to be people mostly studied remission and evaluated, when they look at clinical outcomes, did remission occur? Now we're going to see these broadened definitions that include like improved well-being, quality of life, increases in social support perceived, improved health. These are kind of global life type definitions, and we're going to try to see if they're valid. So if people are experiencing symptoms of alcohol use disorder and then those symptoms decrease over time, are those decreases occasioned by improvements in quality of life and well-being and all the other parts of the definitions. And so it's an advance on current research because most of the studies that evaluate the broader definitions used individual differences data. So they're just looking at differences between people. Most often it may be one time point, maybe 2 time points. And what we're going to do is look within persons that change. So people compared to themselves at prior time points instead of people just compared to other people, and see if they go into remission over time, does that change correlate with an increase in the experience of quality of life or something like that for them. And then I guess what we hope to do is inform some of the messaging around what recovery is, and then form the development of measures that can be used to assess recovery broadly defined, so we can kind of move beyond. It's all part of a movement to get beyond just acute care where you cycle people in and out of treatment, and you follow them longer term and provide support in the longer term, and provide support that is kind of a little more holistic. I don't necessarily like that word a whole lot, but I'm going to use it. And so hopefully we can help develop an assessment that's part of that. Yeah, I think that's probably most of what the grant's about.
Excellent. Well, it's all obviously, laudable and noble work and noble aims and everything, and just from a general societal benefit point of view. But I just wanted to latch on there to the fact that you're looking to broaden, or perhaps subcategorize different versions of, or different interpretations of the construct of recovery, because I think for the average layperson, and sort of myself included, I think the terms recovery and remission are kind of interchangeable, if not coterminous. That basically you when you associate someone with being in recovery, by definition they are in remission. And then yet, as someone, particularly, maybe not particularly, but as someone who used to work in the music industry, I worked with a lot of people that went into recovery, and they went into recovery and they did recover, quote unquote, but their quality of life thereafter was not actually very good. I just picked up when you're talking about, like, we're looking to bring well-being into the mix and things like that. And I think just again, as a layperson, this is where within-person research seems to be where it could shed some more light on this, right? Because it seems like there's a lot of people out there in the world who recover and they get past their dependence on alcohol or some other substance, that they're dependent on. But then that's kind of where it ends. It's not like their quality of life becomes transformatively different after that. They've put one demon to bed, one important demon to bed, but it's kind of like they've been, just set themselves at square one, and there's no kind of effort to understand how they move up to square two and then beyond that. So how do you think, in particular, maybe for those of us or those people in the audience who don't understand the differences between person studies and within-person studies, how do you think the within-person approach is going to make all the difference in trying to cash out these different, I guess, would you call them subconstructs of recovery, or these, different understandings, broader understandings of recovery that you're trying to develop here with your work?
Yeah, so you're touching on a levels of analysis issue, which I think there's like a major problem with it in social and behavioral science. It's basically like a misalignment between the theory and the data analysis. And so if you're looking at like individual differences level, would be just like differences between people at a certain time point. Usually, sometimes people will evaluate a process theory with those data, which is kind of what's happened with recovery to an extent. And when you do that, you're just conflating sources of the differences. So usually what people do is assume, I guess most of the research I see that's on individual differences, they'll assume they're looking at kind of like the person average. So like if I'm, my agreeableness levels may change over time. And then if people take a snapshot of me at one time point, they'll assume that's kind of representative of my average level of agreeableness. But actually, it's just, it's a composite of sort of stable influences on my agreeableness level, and then the influences that change from day to day or moment to moment or whatever. And so in this case, yeah, you may look at somebody who's early in recovery and things may seem pretty tough, but they could be doing a little better, than they were yesterday or last month. And so at the within person's level, you can look at that because you're comparing them to themselves and looking at trajectories and what predicts sort of the trajectories that people follow. But there are some studies that, like John Kelly led some of them. He did at least one of them that looked at how long does it take for people out in the population who are entering recovery to like kind of achieve the population average level of quality life. I can't remember the number exactly. I think it's like 20 years or something like, or maybe 15 years. It's more than a decade, I'm sure of that. So, I mean, that's good to know that people do improve in terms of quality of life a lot. And there's probably a lot of variation around the average time it takes to reach the population average. But as far as like individual improvements go in clients, then it can be more useful to compare yourself today to yourself yesterday, because they're always, like, even small gains can be important if they accumulate over time.
Yeah, and I think that this just reflects as a coach, this reflects just sort of good general practice that I think, we advocate for among our coaching clients, is that, making comparisons with yourself, even if it's an N of one informal experiment, is going to be much more meaningful to the average person and much more psychologically healthy, I think, for the average person than making even informal between persons comparisons. The formal version of a between person study is one thing, but I think just at the individual level of experience, it's much more helpful to compare what you were like to yourself yesterday than it is to like look at other people and say various stages of treatment and make inferences from there. I'm not saying, that those inferences or comparisons have no value, but I would imagine in terms of encouraging ongoing flourishing, encouraging someone to stay with their recovery, that would be much more meaningful to make those kind of within-person comparisons. But I think we might need to just like take a step back here in terms of just like definitional bedrock in terms of what substance use disorder actually is. So what all exactly is a substance use disorder, and like what factor or factors differentiate a substance use disorder from mere substance use? Or assuming it's nowhere near that binary, what is the clinical or diagnostic threshold that would distinguish a disordered user of substances from, say, the person who stops short of that threshold? I mean, at what line does something like, call it behavioral non-optimality with regard to substance use, when does something like that, broadly conceived, cross the line into becoming actual pathology with regard to substance use?
Well, the thresholds change over time, and they're just a little arbitrary, so they will change between versions of the diagnostic and statistical manual that we use. But I think it's pretty clear now that it's better to think of the symptoms as reflecting a continuum or dimension than underlying categories or types. So there really isn't any qualitative difference probably between people who have substance use disorder and people who don't quite meet the criteria. Their use is just a little more severe. They're experiencing a little bit more frequent cravings or withdrawal symptoms. But usually, if you're considering whether to get treatment or not, if you're experiencing withdrawal and symptoms of dependence, then it's probably a good idea. So I don't know. It's kind of descriptive. Most of the psychopathologies really are descriptive. We don't usually really know one or a few underlying causes that account for the associations among the symptoms. So it's not like diabetes where you can like actually, tell if somebody has the underlying dysfunction that causes diabetes. And then you also have separately the symptoms. We define and recognize these things just by symptoms, which is circular reasoning. But you got to be able to provide services to people somehow and build third parties. So these are things that we need to help people that are in distress. But scientifically, it's all, it's a little frustrating. It's one of the things I like to work on is how well do our kind of measurement and assessment models seem to reflect, an underlying real entity.
And I guess just like, I mean, how difficult is it, given that what I imagine is huge variability in that symptomatology? Just how hard is it? I mean, I guess this is all part of your work right now, trying to get something that's as uniform and as, you know, has as broad-based applicability as possible. But given what has got to be a massive variance, or inter-individual variance in symptomatology, just how much of a challenge is that? In the work that you're doing, trying to
Mhm.
develop models and measures and things like that can be meaningfully administered to a broad section of the population and actually deliver meaningful results.
Yeah, we can do it. But you reminded me, so I coordinate the substance abuse counseling program at University of Cincinnati, and like a large proportion of the students in that program are in recovery themselves. So I talked to them about this stuff, and some of them would say, recovery is unique to each person, and there is nothing that, besides the decrease in the substance use disorder symptoms, there might not be anything else that's generalizable across people in terms of the process that they go through. Well, that's really an empirical question. You could see how similar the structure of recovery, how similar does it look? And that starts with measurement. You define your concept, and in this case, if it's like recovery, some people define it as this unidimensional construct. So there's just one recovery factor, one dimension, and people are experiencing higher and lower levels of it. And if the indicators of recovery, like the things like quality of life and alcohol use disorder symptoms, if those all reflect the underlying factor well enough, another way of saying that would be well, how do I want to explain that? You will specify a statistical model and as if it generated the data that you observe in your data set, and then you'll test it and see if it can reproduce the observed associations well enough. And if it can, and if the single underlying factor explains the covariance among the indicators well enough, it could be useful to use a single recovery score. You might not lose much, if any, information if things go well enough. So that single score would tell you everything you need to know about why the recovery indicators are associated. And it would also capture everything you need to know about the associations among the recovery indicators and everything else that's not recovery. But it's a pretty strict bar to pass, like that score is a sufficient statistic, and it's captures everything about how the recovery indicators relate to all the things in people's lives, that change. So I think that's kind of unrealistic that it's that simple, or that it could be summarized that simply with one score. A lot of the studies have done their analyses at the subscale level. So they've already composited a bunch of items to create a recovery indicator, and then they're looking at the associations among those composites. And we've done some work finding that when you do that, you ignore that a lot of the items reflect all kinds of stuff. So if you have like a big five personality model and you have agreeableness, so if you compute agreeableness score, you're just assuming that score tells you everything about how the agreeableness items are related to the other big five traits, like neuroticism. And that doesn't seem to hold up. A lot of the items reflect multiple, several big five factors. And when you pretend they don't, the omitted associations between the factors and certain items get expressed in the correlations among the scores and inflate them. So it looks like big five are more correlated than they really are. So they're like all these papers on general factor of personality and how does evolution maintain that thing in the population, or the differences in the general factor in the population. We found if you use an approach that lets an item load on any factor, you get these smaller correlations among big five. Neuroticism is not even correlated with some of the factors anymore, so there's no GFP. And so I think something similar could happen with recovery, where when you do everything at the item level, you've got sort of lots of recovery factors instead of just one. But we'll have to see what happens, because then another paper I did that's under review, we looked at drinking motives and audit C-scores. Audit's a risk assessment scale that looks at frequency of drinking and frequency of binge drinking. There's one other item. It's just 3 items. But we found when you use that same approach, lets the items load on all the factors, it looked like the audit C items don't measure something separate from the drinking motives items, and they all reflect just one single factor, how much do I want to drink factor, and then that predicts the occasions that people drink on. It explains the relationships, or I guess it explains the gender and other demographic factor effects on drinking occasions and drinking motives items and audit C items. So it could be just as simple as some people want to drink more than others, and it's not really so important to know about the effects of specific drinking motives. Like if I want to drink more, I'm going to drink more to cope. I'm going to drink more to enhance things. I'm going to drink more in different occasions, and my drinking, because that motive is going to be more frequent and severe. So that's like a discriminant validity problem if audit C scores don't tap into something different than the drinking motive questionnaire items.
Right. And I want to come back to the idea of statistical validity a little bit later in our discussion, but because I think for some of us anyway, it is a fascinating topic to cover. But I just wanted to just lock in on something you mentioned there about like unidimensionality, and the fact that you guys are sort of like making your best efforts to factor analyze the hell out of this and sort of get things to as parsimonious and a model and a set of measures as we can possibly get to. But maybe just setting aside the statistical realities and how they're unfolding for now, what are your intuitions like personally about the prospect that some people, and we may develop, as part of your work, we may develop better methods for determining this. How doomed are some people to just not being able to recover? Because I someone who's very close to me and my family, and as you said, it breaks my heart to even bring this person's example up, but this person, alcohol is their problem. They have been in and out of quote unquote recovery multiple times, taken every avenue that's been made available to them, and I just don't see it. Like as cynical as it might sound, and pessimistic as it might sound to say this about a close family member, I actually kind of think she's doomed, and I just do not see a path back for her. Now, do some, maybe it's, vanishingly small, but do some people, just based on your intuitions, or maybe based on what you've come to know with the data, do some people in society really just fit that description, in so much as recovery realistically is a non-starter for them?
I think we can't know, because sometimes we know, if they died, then we know they didn't sort of maintain a recovery process and remit. But one issue is the generalization from what we know from research studies to a single individual, which will be a lot. So we can't really do that. And then the other piece of it is, we don't have any variables that I know of that predict whether people will enter recovery well enough to tell us that. And people who have had severe and persistent substance use disorders have recovered. Like things seem terrible, and they they were overdosing and been brought back to life and overdose more, and eventually they experience some mental shift, and 12 steps starts working for them, or counseling starts working for them, and we don't know a lot about that. There's like maybe one study looking at kind of types of hitting bottom, which is kind of a fraught concept to some extent, because it's a circular reasoning type thing where, well, if they didn't start recovery yet, they hadn't hit bottom yet.
Yeah, right. That makes sense.
And then also hitting bottom could be like dying. So, that concept has some problems, but they just looked at types of hitting bottom experiences, like as people described them. And I think they just divided it into 3 types. And as I recall, they didn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Okay, well,
so we don't know a lot about that yet.
Yeah. I guess. The main point there is, like you said, it's very, very hard to generalize from an individual case towards a general population, and that there's plenty of, as you said, circular reasoning in there. Like if they, things like what if they did die, but they were on their way to recovery? If we had some way of knowing finally they were on the trajectory that was going to get them back towards good health and recovery, and they just happened to die along the way. So I guess you're right. It might be a little bit of a specious question, and we might not never.
Well,
you know,
it does get it. There are some recent studies looking at recovery prevalence, like how many people have ever had substance use disorder identify as being in recovery, or how many say they have resolved the substance use problems. And it's a lot of people. It's like, how many was it? Maybe 50 million people. That's out of the same lab at Harvard. John Kelly and some other people did. I think there's maybe they've done a couple studies of recovery prevalence using national data, and then I believe it was National Survey of Drug Use and Health added an item about this, and it is a lot. And I think they found half of all people who ever met the criteria for substance use disorder reported being in recovery or having experienced problem resolution. So like there is some hope in that, I think, and it's neat that that we know that now, because up until recently the view was it's a chronic and progressive disease, which is a little bleak.
Right. And there's more grounds for optimism now than there has been in times past, which is at least encouraging on the face of it. All right, well, let's make a little bit of a pivot now, because you and I guess the overlapping circles in our Venn diagrams being that we've both presented at evolutionary science conferences before, and we have some shared interest in evolutionary theory more generally. So I wanted to ask you, what do you make of the broad idea that we as humans are evolutionarily predisposed to want to alter our consciousness, and that whatever the particular poison in question, most or all of us are inclined to shift our phenomenology in some way? And then there's this extended idea that there's possibly some distal adaptive value in that. Some people oversimplify one particularly questionable version of this as the, quote, stoned ape theory. So I want to know what you make, what do you make of this general notion of consciousness alteration as an adaptation, or at least some evolutionary byproduct or holdover from our ancestral past? And where does your view of it leave you with respect to disordered substance users? Is the desire to alter one's consciousness through exogenous means, natural and normal in many, perhaps most people? Is that still a desire that disordered users should continue to nurture in some way?
Well, there are individual differences. Some people do not like the experiences provided by psychoactive substances. So then it will, I think, becomes a question of, why do some people want to alter their consciousness? Then some of them want to do it more than others. Probably sensation seeking predicts it. And then you're at the individual differences level. And so you got to have some mechanism like balancing selection or something that could account for the maintenance of some genetic differences between people. So I think I've seen some of that reasoning occurring at the individual differences level. I think people are generalizing from the species level or between species level to individual differences without formally connecting those two levels. But then some of it's like Ed Hagen at Washington State did some stuff looking at hunter-gatherers who used cannabis and found that they had lower health loads. So it seems like for certain substances, there may be a protective effect against macroparasite infection. That's pretty cool. And I don't know if anybody's replicated, his work on that. But yeah, there's that. A lot of the substances seem to evolve to protect plants from insects and herbivores. And they do that. They do protect them. So my guess is, I think that's the simplest theory, is that they evolved these defenses against herbivores, and humans found that they're kind of helpful in some ways. And the sensation seekers among us are the people that were, for one reason or another, genetically a little more prone to experiencing like sensitization of importance in the context of use. They probably end up wanting to use more than other people.
All right, and that's actually right there is an ideal transition into my next question, I guess, just in terms of individual differences, because you mentioned the term sensation seekers. So, I mean, I am myself, and I've never shied away from being open about this, and I work with professionally with a number of people who match this description as well. I mean, I self-identify, maybe not always using this exact term, as a psychonaut. You know, I kind of love to go wandering way outside of the gated community of my own consciousness, as it were, from time to time. And I kind of like a lot of people who get into psychoactive substances, I actually learn a lot about myself in doing so. I think it's actually helped me become a more emotionally stable, more intellectually curious person as a result. And there seems to be, there seems to have been a real surge in actual legit research studying the benefits of, psychedelics in particular, but other commonly used recreational substances, MDMA, things like that, for all manner of therapeutic purposes. I think I have this right in saying that most of this research is still being directed towards understanding PTSD, but I think now it's branching out into other aspects of psychopathology as well. And I think Johns Hopkins in particular, but also maybe Stanford, I want to say, have been at the forefront of this movement. And so I just wonder if, and perhaps how, your own work in research, your own work in substance use and disordered substance use research, if it ever rubs up against this kind of research. Like, is there any kind of dialogue going on now between the folks who research how some people bounce back from using substances and the folks who research how some people bounce back by using substances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think they're like in 12 steps community, especially among some older people in 12 steps, they will not see the logic of using one substance to deal with a substance use disorder. But they are different. They have different risk and harm profiles, which usually don't correlate with the scheduling too well. But yeah, I think they've looked at depression, tobacco use, and things look pretty promising. I think one of the biggest studies just came out. It was from some group in the UK. Things look pretty promising in that paper too. So yeah, so we'll see. I did a study with a doctoral student. That's his main interest, is psychedelic assisted treatment, and we just looked at counselor attitudes toward the integration of psychedelics into counseling. And like most people thought, we need a little more research on it, but they seem mostly open to the idea. People are already doing that. They're already using it as adjunct to counseling, and a lot of people report that it's helpful. I don't know how well investigated the harms or like potential longer term harms. I had found a data set, a longitudinal set, that they actually asked people about their psychedelic use in it, and that was like maybe 1990, and they're still collecting data, so you can look and see what's happened over time. And I reached out to, I think his name's Roland Griffiths. He's the guy at Johns Hopkins, and he said, I was trying to figure out if that was, maybe it was fundable to do a study on that set, and he said, well, you might frame it like you're investigating the potential long-term harms, and then maybe the NIDA and NIAAA directors will think it's a significant piece, because I guess they've been a little reluctant to fund research into the benefits of psychedelic use.
Right. And do you think there might be, I mean, maybe this is an imperfect analogy, but do you think there might be some reservation on some people's parts about using, say, psychedelics to assist people from recovering from, say, alcohol usage, in the way that people have reservations about vaping and e-cigarettes being, preferable alternatives to smoking? Not a perfect analogy, I recognize.
Yeah, some people are a little opposed to harm reduction in general. I think you could think of it from that perspective, but I don't even know if people, need to engage in ongoing psychedelic use to experience a benefit. So that makes it a little different than maybe vaping or or e-cigarettes.
Yeah, it's more of a reset factor,
I
right?
would think.
I mean, I think even for most people who,
Maybe.
I think for most people even who like recreationally use things like mushrooms and acid and stuff like that, they're not for the greatest preponderance of people. Certainly, people I know, and so this is anecdotal, obviously, but they're not party drugs, right? They're not drugs that you take to go out and get wasted per se. They're ones that you have, you take quite purposively and quite intentionally because there is actually a phenomenological project that comes along for the ride. Like that there's something you get to learn about yourself and the way that you think or the way you process visual imagery or whatever it might be. There's kind of an upside to it where, just sort of to your point, I think for a lot of people, one and done could be enough, right? It could be enough that, just that one LSD experience is enough to kind of like reset their overall phenomenology, recalibrate themselves mentally, and then, start this profitable path towards recovery. It's you're right. It's not like vaping in that respect where it's kind of an ongoing, adjuvant, if not outright substitute for a far more toxic and deleterious product.
Yeah, there's not evidence against what you're saying there. Like, so far the findings are promising, and there are even studies looking at, there's like a mystical experiences questionnaire that they give the people after their psychedelic experiences, and I think they followed them like a year or two, and they still thought that the experience, it was like the most significant experience that they'd had in their lives. So it is I think the stuff you're saying is plausible, at least that,
Yeah, and I think it touches on, whether I ended up being, vindicated as if I've got a big dog in this fight either way. But, whether what I've just said ends up being vindicated or not, it just seems to me at least worth pursuing. I remember I was dating a woman many years ago who was in Narcotics Anonymous, and their whole philosophy was, so her problem was heroin, right? So her problem was heroin and Roxy's and stuff like that, opiates. And her, the philosophy of the NA group that she was working with was that you have to understand that you're an addict to all things. And so that basically it's not just heroin. You can't just smoke a joint and get high like a quote unquote regular person can. You can't just have a beer after work. It has to be this all or nothing, black or white binary thing. I mean, maybe this is just kind of like your hot take impression, but do you think that maybe psychedelic research provides some window by which that needn't necessarily be true? And that, maybe there are some people for whom it just is best to be all or nothing. I'm not sure. I'm kind of speculating and talking out of school here, but do you think there might just be that sliver of opportunity for people who otherwise would have been told you have to take nothing, never, and make it just a black or white thing? Could it move in the direction of something like strategically use this and only this, or only these now and again as an alternative to the thing that you were kind of in the throes of previously?
Yeah, I think we already have that in methadone and Suboxone. Like, even if somebody thinks of themselves as having a so-called addictive personality, that it can be a few different or many different things that they could become addicted to. They're addicted to heroin and they don't go on Suboxone, they're most likely going to relapse, like just about everybody does. So I think that will be a case where you've got to, and we have like great evidence about that. So you just have to look at the evidence and you can see what happens with people. I think with psychedelics, it'd be the same thing, and you will see, well, for clients with similar characteristics to you, this was beneficial. But I think that's kind of some black and white thinking too, where somebody identifies as just having addictive personality type. As far as I know, there are no personality types. It's all a bunch of continuous traits. So some people may kind of fall at the extreme end on a lot of traits, and maybe they are prone to becoming addicted to activities that are pretty reinforcing, or substances that do a real good job of sensitizing salience, have higher captured addiction rates. But it can't be everything. Some substances don't have high capture to addiction rates, and they aren't very toxic. So, so I just don't know. I mean, there are studies showing that people liable to, like gambling addiction and things like that, are more liable to substance use disorders. So I think there is a personality aspect that crosses the disorders, I guess.
Gotcha. And I wonder as well how much of this has kind of been garbled in translation because of like lay level misunderstanding. So you mentioned methadone, right? Like I can imagine a number of people, like just like lay people, if you said to them, all right, Mr. X was on heroin for 10 years of life, and now he's on methadone and he's recovering well. Those people would be like, well, thank God he's in recovery, right? But if you said to the same people, this guy's been on heroin for 10 years and he took mushrooms once and had this profound experience, and then he's off heroin or something like that. And I realize this is a very either or loaded to hell example, but I just feel like there would be pushback in example 2 that you wouldn't get in example 1, because methadone is this commonly accepted, clinically approved, and being clinically approved for many years now, alternative to heroin. And when we hear that someone is on methadone as opposed to heroin, we can, we congratulate them on their road to recovery and so forth. And yet with these, psychedelics, say, for example, which I guess, are not, they've moved out of the experimental phase, but they're still kind of very embedded in jury still out mode. I just wonder if, like, because of lay misunderstandings of what recreational drugs are and the connotations that come along for the ride and stuff like that, if the same people that would be celebrating someone's move to methadone would still repudiate their move to something like a one-off usage of DMT or ayahuasca or something like that. So do you think some of this is just about lay misunderstandings around what drugs are and the way they've sort of been presented to the public at large?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about psychoactive substances out there. Some people may be more open to the idea of psychedelics than Suboxone. I think it is still kind of stigmatized, and even some treatment providers are reluctant to refer people. But yeah, I'm sure you can find, I mean, it probably has something to do with, how they think about mystical experiences in general. Some people may not be very open to that idea in general, and then that could kind of transfer to their thinking about psychedelics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, look, with the last, say, quarter of our podcast time, I want to make another pivot and start winding things down with your considered takes on 2 big areas in academia and scientific enterprise. So theory and statistical validity, which we were talking about a little bit earlier. So we'll get to stats in a moment, because I know that you're very dab hand at this. So starting with theory. When we were teeing up this podcast, you suggested talking about, and I quote verbatim, what makes a theory scientific and how hard are we trying to falsify our pet theories? So in my own doctoral discipline of organizational behavior, I really think people aren't trying very hard at all. And business-oriented fields, organizational psychology, organizational behavior, and so forth, have this added rub of being jammed with tons of pop psychology that kind of sort of sustain many of these pet theories and keep them fertile and keep them passionately argued for by their supporters, no matter how empirically insubstantial they actually turn out to be, or unsubstantiated, I should say. But you honestly don't see that much direct reckoning or grappling with these theories, or an effort to deliberately uncover any of the things we might have missed. So from like a sort of Popperian falsification point of view, feels like organizational behavior have just completely flown the coop from my point of view. But it just seems to me like in my own neck of the woods, scholarly neck of the woods, earnest efforts at falsification have at best given way to just like non-stop p-hacking and the file drawer effect, and that's if people even go to that much effort. Sometimes they won't even go to that much effort, right? So what are your thoughts on how we're approaching this idea of how wedded we are to our pet theories, perhaps in psychology specifically, but maybe also your thoughts on how this is affecting the social scientific enterprise at large as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we aren't trying that hard. Like, I see people who care a lot about science, like, are obsessed with it. They write papers and they say, like, it's our formalization of theory is the problem. It's our sample sizes that's the problem. But none of this stuff's new. I learned in school that you got to have bigger sample sizes and that you shouldn't make decisions based on the findings as they emerge. And I had experiences with faculty who wanted me to use like different modeling approaches because the effect we hadn't detected the effect that they were looking for. We've always known that, I think, was a problem. I mean, I think it's careerism, and people are seeking to advance their careers, and there really is no punishment for sticking with a theory and talking about it, even if there's a lot of evidence against it at a conference. And then like younger people like me, once I was just starting out, and certain theory can seem exciting and they get excited about it. That's really all you need to keep things going, I think. That and some control over the review process at journals, or if you have access, if there are some journals with lower standards, then you can keep on publishing. And at a lot of universities, in your career advancement process, they're going to look at probably publication numbers, to some extent, the impacts of the journals. I'd be surprised if a lot of committees thoroughly read the papers written by people going up for tenure or promotion.
Oh, I would be astounded. I would be absolutely astounded if that were the case. It just in terms of like the level of scrutiny or lack thereof that I've observed, I would be astounded if that was the case. I mean, it seems like so in the business psychology fields, it feels like every time Academy of Management journal or Leadership Quarterly is bringing out a new issue, there's some paper titled something along the lines of "What is theory?" and or how are we applying theories or whatever. We're still having these same annoying, it's almost dignifying them too much to call them meta conversations, but these conversations about the conversations about theory, it's getting old. Just it feels like so much water has gone under that bridge in science generally more now, that the idea that we are still having to have introductory articles, commentary articles in these journals with massive impact factors, still having commentaries around things like just what is theory, just a bedrock understanding of what theory is. That shows how much work we have to do. And just to your point about like careerism, and I get that people have to be pragmatic. I get that academia is a system that is rife with all the wrong kinds of incentives if your real motivation is genuine scientific inquiry. That's not to make it sound any more cynical than it needs to, but just to your point, people have got to jump through the hoops and stuff, right? But as it pertains to what we've just been talking about, I've been to so many conferences where there'll be some session which is specifically dedicated to the application or the empirical cashing out of some particular theory, and the whole session is just a hactathlon. And I'm no statistical genius, as I'm going to mention in a moment. But I know enough that when I see a poster or a presentation at a conference, that's just you can just tell how much they are bending over backwards to justify a theory because they feel they have to. Right, if they came up with those findings that were just short of statistically significant, what's the point in bringing them up? Well, what's the point? How much is it going to give your career a shot in the arm to do that, right? So that there's so many disincentives, and yet I don't think it's being catastrophic about it to say that this kind of stuff is crippling scientific inquiry.
Yeah, I think so. I guess it's hard to kind of be detached from the ideas and kind of feel fine whether they're right or wrong early on, at least. But I think you can do that. You do it by trying to learn as much about methods as you can, and kind of try to build your reputation as somebody who tries to do like rigorous studies, because they're significant. Whatever you find, they can be significant. The findings will be significant because it was a well-designed study. So the observations, you can map them to the entities, the theory specified, and you got good tests of well-powered tests of effects, and so and you're helping everybody out if you find a bunch of null stuff, because now they can spend less time working on a theory that's mostly invalid. But yeah, I think that's everywhere. And I think somebody said to me, I've written before that measurement is the foundation of science. Somebody else wrote that somewhere, and I picked it up, and I think it is. I mean, and in most sciences, I don't think anybody would argue with that, but they do in social and behavioral science. Some people think theory is the foundation, and you don't have to worry too much about how you got the scores that you're using to evaluate the validity of the theory. So I think if you give that kind of privilege to theory, you end up kind of running roughshod over the data, and you probably design studies that they don't provide very severe tests of that theory, because that's a little scary, and it can hurt too. I think, like, I did the work on life history theory, and there was there's like one dimension. I mean, I got excited about that stuff because there was kind of a model of why all these different things in human life could vary. Like, how come when somebody scores high in delinquency, they also are using more substances, have more sexual partners, their health will be poorer. How come all this stuff goes together? That's what I was interested in, and it seemed like life history theory could provide an explanation. And it turned out nobody formally connected the between species theorizing about life history traits to the within species variation. So we don't know if the causes of the between species differences, evolved differences, we don't know if they're the same as the cause of the within species differences. So that's a pretty big logical gap. And then I didn't find the single dimension that other people had found, and it was hard to get that published. Todd Shackelford eventually we included in a special issue in the Evolutionary Psychology Journal. But then other people found the same thing. You can't summarize across 20 domains of human life with one score.
Right.
Anyway, you could see how this relates to recovery stuff. It's a similar thing. You have models of lots of domains of life, maybe these global life dimensions, one or a few of them. How come we keep seeing that? That's like kind of the burning question to me. And it's not even in those two areas. It also comes up in gender research, where people took differences between males and females on some traits and said those traits are gendered traits. And then they said that's gender. And the ones the males score higher on, that's masculinity. And then I saw a paper that talked about the big two dimensions of gender, which were called masculinity and femininity. Now they're called agency and communion. And communion looks pretty much like the K dimension in the life history research. Agency, it looks a little bit more, I don't know, it looks a little like a mating competition factor I had in one paper. But they had no formal theory connecting the existence of two sexes to individual differences within each sex. That's kind of the same problem again. But you do get that covariance. Those, all those traits relate for some reason. It's either a method artifact, or a lot of things sort of go together in human life for some interesting reasons.
Right. And now maybe we could just linger there for a moment before we jump back into stats at large. I just want to linger on that point for a moment, because I know it's part of your interest in some of the work you've done. What does your understanding of genetics tell you about how genes confound aspects of our developmental or life history outcomes? I mean, we don't necessarily need to belabor the formal definition of life history. I guess we could work with a lay understanding of what life history means. I know the scholarly definition is quite different, but I find that even quite serious scholars, when it comes to genetics, still seem to be resting on a kind of lipstick on a pig version of nature versus nurture when it comes to this topic. Among lay people, genes really are just a ripe source of confusion about their causality and who one becomes and the contributions they make to who you are. So what do you think about genes as, just building off what you just said, what do you think about genes as confounders in development? What do you read into their role in our life history? And ultimately, what role do they play in, I guess, maybe confusing or obscuring some truths that might, like the one you mentioned about gender and things having gender differentiation? What sort of a role do genes play in making issues like that and discussions like that more complex than they currently are, more confounding than they currently are?
Yeah, I think that's another levels of analysis confusion where, like, even academics, they'll say nature nurture that's BS because you have to have both in development, and that's true at the within person's level. Like any certain person, wherever they are at any moment, it's a product of their genes and their environment. So the differences at that level are product of that stuff. Like me today compared to yesterday could be some difference in gene expression. It could be environmental differences that account for the change. But then at the between persons level, like the genetic factors themselves, there's some changes in expression within people, but by and large, it's differences between people in genetics. So you can decompose the differences between people into the environmental and genetic components, and you could do that by comparing levels of relatedness among siblings. That's just one way. And then you can look and see, well, backing up a little bit, you can first just look within families and see if effects hold up. Like, say you have adverse childhood experience that you think causes depression, and you see it at the individual differences level in the population. Then you can go and look within families and see if the sibling that experienced more of that exposure is also more depressed. And that'll control for all genetic factors they share. So it'll control for a good part of the bit of genetic differences between families. And it'll also control for everything that varies pairwise between the siblings, like socioeconomic status or father presence or absence if they're the same age. All that kind of stuff, it'll control all those confounds. And then if it's like a genetically informative design, you can see, so the between families differences, to what extent are they due to genetic differences between the families or environmental differences. And I think in academia, a lot of people don't want to accept, some of the findings from behavior genetics still, because some of those findings kill developmental theories that they've worked on a long time. Like one is that the timing of puberty translates early stress into later outcomes like riskier sex or mental health outcomes, that kind of stuff. I think that's one. The timing of puberty, at least in females, seems to be about 100% heritable. No, not 100% heritable. What am I talking about? There's no shared environmental effect, no shared environmental component. So once you've accounted for the part of the correlation between the siblings that's due to genetics, there's no part of the correlation that's left. That's it. And so I think that shows that there's no effects of stuff like father absence or socioeconomic status on the timing of puberty in females, at least.
Right. And just to go back to, like what we were talking about before about, self-interest in people being wedded to their pet theories, I can imagine stuff like that is not good news for certain people and their pet theories anyway. But such is the nature of science. Some people, unfortunately, have to change their mind, or should be reasonably expected to change their mind when the new evidence comes flowing in. But we're almost upon the hour, so let's go back to some statistics and wrap up a little bit of stats, because you strike me as someone who has leagues more skin in this game than I do. At grad school, using M+ almost made me go insane, especially with item response theory. But in any case, I recall you hearing you speak at a couple of conferences, and just remembering that you have tremendous authority when it comes to statistics. And so I wanted to get your take on all these so-called, or at least one of these so-called crises in psychology. I think the replicability crisis has been done to death, so maybe we can bypass that altogether, or only need dabble in it in a bit. But from your perspective, I'm more interested to hear your take on the validity crisis. So first, what is the validity crisis such that it is a crisis? And just what kind of grounds does the average person have, much less what a qualified statistician has, to have faith in the validity of the constructs that are typically developed in psychology? And on top of that, just maybe when it comes to cross-cultural research in particular, which is a big feature of evolutionary psychology, do you have any thoughts on the purported over-reliance on where WEIRD, Western, et cetera, industrialized samples with respect to this aspect of statistical validity, and particularly as it applies to cross-cultural research?
Yeah, so I think it was like a guy named Yuli Shimak. I don't know how you pronounce his name. I only knew him through Twitter. When I was on Twitter, he's an interesting Twitter personality. I think he used that in a paper, that term in a paper that was in the journal Meta Psychology, maybe. And he was pointing out that we probably don't know how valid a lot of our scores are. And that seems true to me. I mean, most of the constructs I've looked at, it's like the closer you look at them, the more they fall apart. And that seems, that information suggesting that things fall apart doesn't seem to have a lot of effect. Like a good example is individualism, collectivism. There are like reviews showing that if you look at factor structure across cultures, you don't get similar factor structures. Like sometimes one culture there's one factor, another culture two, another three. So you really can't compare people on the same score, set of scores. And I think one of the articles was called like the Emperor with No Clothes or something like that. But papers are published every day that are, testing theories about individualism and collectivism using scores. Now you could do some work, even if scores are bad, you can still sometimes move forward, at least in research, with latent variable models, because you can let some of the parameters be different across samples. Usually you need the same number of factors or dimensions, though, to be able to do that. But you can let some things vary. And in evolutionary human behavior, people do a lot on sex differences, a lot of work on doing cross-cultural studies, and often they don't evaluate whether the scores have the same meanings in the groups that they're studying. So usually they'll just sum the scale for the sample as a whole. So everybody gets scores under the assumption that they have the same meaning, and then they do the study. So I had like a little critique paper a little bit ago with two other researchers looking at it. Is like the socio-ecological complexity hypothesis. That was like the idea that in sort of like post-industrialized societies compared to like more traditional societies, you'll get like a more complicated factor structure of personality. Well, the main prediction is that the personality traits will be less correlated because people are going and they're like filling different niches in modern society, and there's so many of them that you get these looser correlations among the personality traits, whereas you get tighter ones like in a traditional society. But they hadn't really looked to see if people in traditional societies, or if they would interpret the items in the same way as people in the United States or someplace like that. So basically, we don't know sometimes if the scores have the same meaning, and I think for a lot of times we could be looking at maybe, well, I don't know. Yeah, I think it's meaningless if you don't know whether the scores have the same meaning in two groups. Then a group comparison is potentially meaningless, and it's probably misleading. You can set up a model where you have, like, say you have agreeableness model, you have 4 agreeableness items, and you fit the model to the data from 2 groups. Then you can just look and see if you constrain all the parameters in the model equal between the groups, like everything's the same, people are attributing the same meanings to the items, and the reason why there are any group differences on the factors on the scores is because of the group differences on the underlying factor that causes the differences in the items. You can look and then you can see how much difference it makes if you assume all that. And then you can look to see what parameters vary between the groups. You can leave them free, and then you can estimate the factor mean difference with parameters that vary by group left free. And you can compare the standardized mean difference in that case to the standardized mean difference you get from scores or when you constrain all the model parameters equal. So you can just see in a practical sense, what's the practical significance of making the assumption that the scores mean the same thing. A lot of times there's a practically important difference. Like there may be no group mean difference when you leave some parameters free between the groups, but when you look at the scores, you get a group mean difference. It's a lot of work to look through all that, but I think that's what you got to do if it's going to be solid science.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And look, I don't want to, as we wind things down, I don't want to sort of talk about notions of scientific imperialism and stuff like that. But as someone who teaches in Vietnam at an English language university, you mentioned individualism, collectivism before. So that's one which comes up a lot in a society like Vietnam, which is not just a, one party communist autocratic state, but is also a, at a societal level, there's always these values of Confucianism and so-called collective participation and things like that we supposedly don't get in the individualistic West. And yet all of the measures that have been used to establish this have been like transliterated from English. It's not like the actual measures have been developed from whole cloth based on situational and contextual specificity. It's just basically we've taken this one measure that we've probably a faulty measure at that, but setting that aside, we've taken this one measure that we've administered to weird populations, primarily English-speaking populations. We've just kind of rejiggered it into a new language. Yes, we might have done test, retest, validity, and found out the test is valid and reliable and stuff like that. But it's still, I mean, this is just a hunch. I just feel like with so many of these tests, like things like individualism, collectivism, were not actually measuring what we're claiming to be measuring. We're not actually capturing what we're claiming to be measuring. And I think a lot of that comes down to what you've just discussed, that basically the way that these tests and these scales and stuff are designed and constructed and stuff like that are just not taking into account enough contextual nuance and things like that might otherwise be more reflective of actual group differences that are there or not there.
Yeah, I agree. I think this might bore some of your listeners because only a few of my students have ever become really excited about measurement work, but I get excited about it. It's because there's a question of whether any of these constructs are real entities or whether in the scores we compute from the scales are at least useful. And I don't think you necessarily have to start all over again in a new context, because you can test, like if we have something like extroversion here and we've done qualitative research and then we've developed items out of the qualitative research, and then if we translate those items into another language and take our scale elsewhere, we can test if the parameters differ between the groups. And if they don't, that will be evidence consistent with the respondents attributing the same meaning to the underlying construct. But you might miss factors like even if you do that and you never did the qualitative research in the new context, you might find there's actually the thing's multidimensional there, and you've captured one aspect of it, but there's some aspects of the construct, if it's multidimensional, that are unique to that context. Yeah, I think a lot of stuff has been explored, like the counseling textbooks, for example. One of my past students, she's a faculty member at University of Las Vegas, Nevada. No, University of Nevada, Las Vegas now. And that was her main interest, and she developed that interest because she took counseling classes in Taiwan, and it was all stuff exported from the United States. And she just was reading that and thinking, I don't know, like, are these concepts really applicable to me? Yeah. But I don't know. I guess maybe we should be optimistic because the software is getting easier and easier to use. Some people say that's a bad thing because then people start doing things without understanding fully what they're doing in their studies. But when I started out doing the measurement variance testing to see if constructs are measured in the same way between groups. You had to like write out all the code and label each single parameter, give it a label, and to be able to constrain it equal between the groups. And now there are these shortcuts you could type in, and it'll constrain all the factor loadings equal at once. And so things are getting easier, and maybe it'll all be automated before long, and you just push a button. It'll actually, I think there are packages that will give you just like a fit, give you fit information at each level of invariance. But it's technology. That's, I guess, how in every field, things really advance when you see some technological improvements. Yeah, it's like, is it really that we stop p-hacking or something like that, or is it that the statisticians just kind of automate things in a way so that we can't screw things up, and that we're able to learn things about constructs, even though there are some differences between groups. There are some approaches now, like alignment, that it'll find the parameters that are invariant across all your groups, even maybe 50 countries if you're studying a lot of countries, and it'll allow you to make the group comparisons based on the parameters that don't vary. That it's pretty interesting. Probably most people don't want to hear too much about.
No, man. I was just going to say I could keep going down the measurement rabbit hole with you forever, and I'm sure many of our listeners actually could as well. But it's probably a good time to begin wrapping things up. Just to close that loop, though, just to say at least there's some grounds for optimism that things might be starting to get a little bit more tractable, a little bit more manageable, and certainly with all the work that you've got on your plate and different things that you've got within your purview, I can imagine that any technological or measurement-oriented advances are only going to be good news for you and making your life a little bit more straightforward. But George, we're out of time, so I just want to thank you so much for making all of this time to join me on the podcast to talk about your work. It sounds like you're doing some very, very commendable work, not just in terms of like how much it is likely to be able to help people, but just how much it's going to enrich our scientific understanding of substance abuse and perhaps take it in new and generative directions. So I really appreciate and applaud the work that you're doing in that space. And also I just appreciate you sharing your thoughts on science, theory, and statistics at a more general level of discussion, and giving us a little bit of a window into your thoughts in those areas as well. So really appreciate the time you've made for me today, and hope we get to do this again, and hope our paths cross again in person sometime again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. Thanks for having me, and hopefully I've gotten pretty cynical. Hopefully I didn't lower anybody's motivation to go into a career in research or anything.
No, I don't think you have. I think you might have actually inspired a few people along the way, but we'll have to see what the net results are of this podcast.
Thanks.
All right, man. Okay, take care of yourself, and we'll speak to each other again very soon, I hope. And it got me thinking.